Hello there, healthcare humans. Thank you for coming back for another episode of The Other Human in the Room. So, today I wanted to talk about blame and our fear of being blamed, how often we blame ourselves, the sense of having to feel and decide, is something my fault or not? Which in my mind is basically us saying, do we blame ourselves or not? I think actually a lot of the mental and emotional stress that a lot of us in healthcare have are in part, at least, because we have this underlying inhuman story and belief that blame is even a thing. So I think it helps to first sort of talk about what I mean by blame, right? So the definition I'm using and I'm sort of just generating now, the way I think of blame is if an outcome happens, so something happens in the world and everyone then looks around and says like who's to blame? Who's at fault? um, who is responsible for this outcome happening, right? And most of the time, even if we're talking about multiple different factors in that, the way it often feels to us emotionally and like somatically in our bodies, and this is because of often how we were raised, our socialization is if we are even a part of that blame, our body registers it as if we are completely to blame. So, say I make a mistake on a prescription, I write the wrong dose, and the patient ends up receiving that medication with the wrong dose and like a harmful, their kidneys shut down or something like something harmful happens to them. Even if I have multiple people saying to me like, well, the pharmacist could have caught it. Well, the patient could have caught it. Like, even if they're like saying that stuff to me, I'm still like, I killed that patient's kidneys. Like, some people really mentally, they're like, no, no, all those people like literally don't exist. And I basically killed that patient's kidneys myself. But even if we cognitively know, like, I know I'm not the only one to blame, when we check in with our bodies and the amount of like horror and shame and deep guilt we feel, and the amount we're reliving it, the amount we're trying to run away from it, it's really coming from this place of like basically we've committed murder on purpose to this person's kidneys. And like we feel that somatically in our body, and that feels really terrible. So most of our time, a lot of us, like when we are in a real anxiety spiral about work, whether it's like, did I chart enough? Did I make any mistakes today? Did that patient like me or not? It's actually ultimately because we are trying to get away from future potential blame. If I completely, chart to a perfect standard, if I never make a mistake, if every patient is happy with me, then no one will blame me. I'll never have to feel this sense of shame and guilt, right? And like, if you could find a way to never feel blame and shame by being perfect, um, send me a message. I'd love to hear how it's going for you. But for those of us listening who are human, it's impossible, right? Which is, I mean, that's one of my themes of this podcast. It's like, hi, you're human. Perfection is impossible. And a piece of the kind of perfection I'm talking about that's impossible is never participating in harm to other people. I had a recent podcast about that, right? Never participating in a bad outcome for a patient, never participating in a perceived bad outcome for a patient, never making a mistake. Like all of those are impossible. They're not just perfection, they're like literally impossible. So it helps then to know what can we do when we find ourselves in a situation where our brain is really freaking out about the fact that something is our fault, right? A little of this in terms of how to take care of ourselves, how to treat ourselves, reduce the harm to ourselves. I did a recent podcast. I think it's podcast number 99. I don't have my screen up to say, but I'm pretty sure that's the one, which is about, do no harm and harm reduction and like what to do when we cause harm. This podcast, I want to actually talk about an additional strategy that not only helps to kind of release and discharge and train our bodies that we don't need to have such an intense, fully responsible, feel as if I've murdered someone kind of feeling, but also is a great like assessment and learning tool for ourselves, not to assess if we're good people, but just to like clear the facts of the situation and come to an understanding of like what even happened from a place of curiosity, from a place where we'd say, huh, like what helped contribute to this outcome, you know? Say anyone listening is involved in things like, debriefs or like M&M rounds or whatever, and especially if the way those roll out, say in your institution, feel very like everyone's basically just trying to dodge the blame bullet and it's like, no, it's definitely all the nurses, no, it's definitely all the patients. Like this kind of exercise could be potentially helpful in showing how many different factors all play a role in like anything happening in the world. Like even if it's not about a bad patient outcome, but like, you know, whether a car crash happens, it's I know we have this sort of at fault blamey society where it's like which one of the two people's at fault, and that's fine. I'm not going to get into like law stuff, but just to say so many things have to be in place for two cars to actually crash into each other, even in terms of like, you know who's got into a fight with their partner so they left 5 minutes later, who was distracted and upset because of something, their dog died, like there's so many factors that lead to a place there. What's the weather like all these factors actually also contribute to two cars colliding, right? And same is true with patient outcomes, very much so, no matter what. Even if you feel like, no, in this case it was me directly and there's no other factors and it is my fault, and it is like, even if I didn't do it intentionally, I'm owning it as if I did it intentionally, and I'm basically a terrible human being, da da da, right? So some of that basically I'm a terrible human being belief system is what I talked about in that past episode. This one is also just clarifying the facts about how any outcome in the world has multiple sources, multiple influences for it to come to fruition. The other beautiful thing about this is for any of you like me who may have, a subconscious belief slash delusion that if we work hard enough, we can control other people in some sort of one-to-one direct way. Also doing this exercise in those cases of being like, I am their doctor. I am but one influence on their lives. Even if I am doing my hardest sell, look at all the other influences that may, their background, their beliefs, the other people in their lives that may be some of the reasons why they're deciding to make this choice instead of that choice. I cannot control them. I can stop trying. I am but one influence. And that is a powerful, beautiful influence. And I can value that influence, but I never get to take full credit or full blame for anything happening in the world, period. So, um, the other thing that we can call it instead of blame, which for blame, it's like this unidirectional, like it's all on me and it's my responsibility, or none of it's on me and I'm totally blameless, which are just two frameworks that aren't that helpful actually. Um, the other framework, and though this is like I first heard about sort of this contrasting idea from Brene Brown, who big fan of, instead of blame, which she describes as like discharging our emotional energy on another person, like when we're blaming another person, which is absolutely a part of like what happens, why we blame each other, Um, the other option is accountability. So whether it's we're inviting someone else to consider taking accountability for something they've done, whether it's to us or to some other thing, or we're inviting ourselves to take accountability. I find depending on where you are, especially in certain online spaces, like accountability has taken on a kind of shamey edge too, especially when it, again, people are trying to force other people to take accountability. Underneath that just sort of feels like the same blamey game, just with a new name. But when I'm talking about accountability, I'm talking about like literally doing some accounting, counting up, taking account of all the different factors that led to this outcome. And I will account for the factors that were within my control or in my camp or that I have more direct influence over and consider how I could alter those, as well as taking into account the fact that there were other factors. And that doesn't discharge me of what is mine to take account or either way. Like the thing that often happens when we think more accountability framework wise is that we always have some role to play, but we are never the only role in the whole thing. We are never the sole actor that caused this thing. The other sort of framework that, or this way of thinking, another source that I've heard this kind of mindset from is from certain kinds of like restorative justice practices. If you've heard of that, I am by no means, I am very not a restorative justice expert, but having read, like, it's a piece of emergent strategy. It's one of the core tenets. Um, and also just hearing, I recall it was actually a patient who was sharing some research they were doing in Indigenous health that they there was a culture where an indigenous culture where if one person commits like a harm like some kind of crime or whatever, the approach of that community is never to be like, is this person guilty or not and how shall we punish them? Instead, the approach of the community is, how is this our collective fault? Or how is this our collective responsibility? What role did each of us in this community play that helped influence this outcome? It including the person themselves. They're not just like hanging out like, you all did this to me. Like, no, they get to account for what they did and the choices they made. And everyone surrounding them, that the belief of this culture, and a belief I would offer is great in any culture, is we are meant to take care of each other. We are only well when we are well together. So if someone committed some kind of harm against another person or against the community in some way, what happened there? And is there, how could we shift things to prevent this person from being in a space where they had the choices, where they felt the need to take that action again? And there's often a lot that can be done. And it's not that you never prevent it, but the remarkable thing about this story is that in that community, they had extremely low, I think the word is recidivism, but if that's not the right word, please insert the correct word. They had low repeat crime rates. Okay. And there could be lots of reasons for it. At this point, like I don't have any citations. This is basically just like a story and a myth, but I think it is beautiful and it is grounded in like actual cultural practices. I know a lot of places that are trying to pilot notions of restorative justice instead of the traditional justice system, say, especially like for young offenders, as sort of those who don't believe in and are abolitionists about like the prison system not actually being quite very humane and also not helping prevent crime. So restorative justice is an alternative. Again, so it's like when someone commits a crime, they still are a participant and involved. The victims of those crimes, if they are willing participants, can also be a part to share the impact, to share what they think needs to be done to sort of make it right or correct it or address the issue. And then there's also community members present who are like, what do we need to support the victim and the perpetrator of the crime? Because both need support clearly in this time, and especially to prevent further crimes from being committed, right? So just that idea, the idea of like the collectivity, it's one of my values, is the sense that like we all belong to each other. We are all connected to each other, not in a codependent way where we're like responsible for each other's feelings, but all of us and our actions every day absolutely have an impact on each other. And when we find ways to hold on to ourselves and both center ourselves and really center ourselves in a way where we feel well, we feel resourced, the next step that flows out of that is taking care of the people around us. It's got to be that order, which is why we got to do that do no harm reduction work first before we consider this. We don't want to now take on all the responsibilities of anyone else. But again, that's why this exercise helps. Like, it refocuses our attention to the piece of what happened that is ours to hold, is ours to consider, is ours to take account for if we so choose. And it's way more manageable to do that. We actually can feel more supported and resourced to do that because it's not literally everything. And we're not awash with shame, which always makes us want to run away from the problem, right? So I've talked enough about the exercise. I'm now going to show you sort of It's very simple. Okay. I've started calling it the spider exercise. I shared it and taught it to the group, the interconnected group, which is the group of healthcare humans. Like it's a group coaching course program that just ended a little while ago for me. Um, because this sort of idea of blame and feeling guilty and shame if a bad outcome happens because it's all your fault, you know. And so I shared it, and originally I had it sort of, it's like this is like a circle and there's spokes, but the more we looked at it, we're like it's like a spider. So that's why I've started calling it the spider exercise. If you're listening to this, I will describe it to you, and it's very not complicated. But if you're watching on YouTube, I'll also just show it to you. And I didn't actually write out an actual case, but I'm going to talk through a fictional case to illustrate how you could use this exercise yourself. Okay. Very simple and very powerful. So here's the diagram. And so for those listening at home, it's a circle. And in the middle of the circle, I just wrote the word outcome. And then I have 8 spider legs, or they're straight though. So like just, it also kind of looks like a sun, like 8 lines coming away from the outcome. That's it. It's and one of those lines at the end of it has the word you. And that's the whole exercise. Very simple, right? And yet, if you actually push yourself to do it, so the next time you have either a situation where an undesired outcome has happened and you are really blaming yourself or trying to shift blame onto someone else so you don't have to secretly confirm the part of you that definitely believes it's your fault. Like, notice when you're really blaming someone else with a lot of fervor, it's usually because secretly you already do blame yourself. Um, so instead of doing that whole dance, instead we could say, okay, it's time for the spider exercise. And the reason I like calling it spider is that means there has to be at least 8 legs. Otherwise, it's not a spider, right? It's the beetle or something. So there's got to be at least 8 legs. I'm counting. Yeah, I did have 8 on here. So 8 different factors. This really pushes your brain because most of us can think of like 1 or 2 different factors. And then it's really interesting, like in the group when I presented it or with like one-on-one coaching clients, when I've done it myself, like by the time you're getting to 7 and 8, sometimes you're really struggling. And that's where the brain breaking goodness actually happens. That's where your brain really has to like release more of the inhuman, inaccurate responsibility and really think more collectively in that like collective way, like collectively, how did this outcome come to pass, right? So one example, I mean, I'll use the example I just said. So say um, I wrote the wrong dose of a prescription, a too high dose. Um, let's get even more specific because what was the outcome again? Oh yeah, their kidneys were hurting. So actually maybe it's this. So maybe it's that I prescribe a medication that I'm aware causes, you know, it taxes the kidneys, it's renally cleared, and I forget that this patient already has kidney disease and I prescribe it. And then the patient goes and takes it, and then they end up with renal failure acutely because it was not a medication that they ought to have taken. That's a case where like I would definitely be awash with blame. I would be feeling really terrible. You know, I'd be like imagining getting sued. And by the way, I might get sued for this. Like, I mean, who can say? This is a theoretical situation, but this was an error and a cause and outcome. It's possible. Like, who knows? So, on top of like really taking care of myself and holding myself through the shame and all the stuff that I talked about not additionally enacting more harm upon myself after I've already participated in harm of someone else, I can ask myself, okay, beyond I will circle around and look at my part in it. I want to take accountability for it, but usually I like emotionally and cognitively can't when I'm still like totally taking full responsibility for the entire thing. So we've got to look at what were the other factors, right? So one factor would be the pharmacy colleague and team involved. And again, this is not shifting blame, but one of the really valuable things that I am so grateful that pharmacists can do is on the prescriptions, it can have written that there are EGFRs on them. I don't know if it always has that or not. So like in this case, it would be hard to say, but say the pharmacist was aware of their medical conditions. They may look at this and say, wait, I've asked you about your medical conditions and you have kidney failure. So I think that this medication is not good for you. And they could fax it back to me. There are times when they do that and I get annoyed because I'm like, no, it's fine. Let them do it. Right. But like, it's possible that in this case, one of the other filters, one of the other places in, that Swiss cheese model that allowed this event to come to pass is that the pharmacist could have done a check and stopped it at that phase, right? So that's another possibility. Another possibility potentially could be that the patient themselves, if they had knowledge, depending on their resource level, etc., they could have knowledge of the disease and could have thought to check into it themselves. Again, this is not saying that those people should have done that so I wouldn't do my thing, but it is true that if either of those people had done those things, which is not implausible to think of it, that may have changed the outcome. That's what I'm talking about here, right? Another thing that led to the outcome is the fact that this patient's body had pre-existing kidney disease. Again, I'm not blaming the body. Who knows why that happened, right? But like the fact is, if this particular body hadn't happened to have kidney disease, if whatever happened to that body in the past hadn't happened, that surgery went wrong, or they'd been on other medication that actually prematurely hurt their kidney, or whatever, like, you know, maybe they had diabetes. Like, so who knows? Like, if those things weren't true, then this outcome would be less likely or would not have happened, right? Like this is the same, like we're not saying who's to blame. I feel like I keep saying it out loud because it feels like I can't talk about all the other factors. It makes me feel like I'm less responsible. But the point is not about weighting who's the most responsible, but just noticing, like the domino effect that is always necessary in order for something to happen. This patient had to actually believe in medication and take their medication as prescribed, something we usually are so delighted when our patients do. And we certainly are not mad at this person for not. It's just that that is also true. The patient chose to take this medication. I didn't put the medication into their mouth, right? Because that's like what my body thinks is like I reached into their body and turned off their kidneys on purpose because that's how horrible I feel. And it's just like other things had to happen too. A million little events, the butterfly's wing had to flap just so for this particular thing to happen. So one of those things is that the patient had to actually take their medication. And so that is one of the factors, right? Um, there's something about the medication itself. So the fact that this medication is something that I would be prescribing because this patient had some other condition and it happened to also not be great on kidneys. Like the medication itself is one of the factors. And also, another spoke is like the fact, again, the patient's body had two conditions, one of which was the kidney problem. And the other condition was one where at least some of the treatments can compound that kidney problem. That's not true in other patients, right? So one of the ways that this came to pass is that patients can have multiple issues in their body at the same time, and the treatments of some can end up influencing the health of other parts of their body. That is true in this case. If they'd never had this rash or whatever it is that I prescribed a pill for to tank the kidneys, that's not a good example, but like, they had this heart problem. I prescribed something for their heart. It ended up hurting their kidneys. I mean, that's a classic, right? So that's like I didn't make their heart sick. I didn't make their kidneys sick. I didn't force them at gunpoint to take medication. You know what I'm saying? So that means I am not directly responsible for any of those parts. We're going to get back around to me and I'm going to look at myself and really reflect on what happened. And in fact, because I'm running out of other spokes, I'm going to say that one next, right? So like the other thing that I think is fair and valid and helpful to reflect on is what were the factors that surrounded me that may have contributed to me? I'm still going to own the choice that I made, but that influenced my decision making frame of mind. Was I rushed that day? Like, in my EMR, if I have entered correctly that they have kidney function issues, I actually will get a flag if I try and prescribe a medication that hurts that. So was it that the EMR was malfunctioning? Maybe. And then that would be another factor. Was it that my capacity to keep up all of the coding of the different um, conditions that the person have is outdated? And that's both my choice of how I spend my time not coding conditions, but also about the fact that time's a limited resource and we have to prioritize each day, right? But those are other factors that would have been another layer of interruption to me making the decision and influencing the ultimate outcome, right? So those are some other factors. Was I having a really rushed day? So maybe the flag came up and I just quickly, like, I ignored it. Because how many times do those flags come up, right? We all get like flag fatigue and we don't even read them. Like, ah, it's probably fine. Yeah. So, like, are there time pressures on their day? Are there ways that, and I can still take accountability. So I can still say the way I set up my time, the way I approach patients where I'm booking them every 5 minutes or something, I can now see that when I am rushed, it is leading to me participating in undesired outcomes for my patients. So now I can take account for my action and also implement a solution that might help prevent a similar error from happening in the future. I can slow down my pace. I can either myself or pay someone to do coding in my EMR. You see how not only is this helpful for like reducing the shame and understanding that collectively so many factors led to this outcome, but especially when I consider sort of the ecosystem in which I made that decision, I can ask myself, which of these do I actually have direct influence over and can make a shift? So could I be less hurried through my day, which I can, first of all, practice mindfulness, take deep breaths, have my phone at the back, be less distracted, get enough sleep, like take care of my body, like all of that good stuff. Also, schedule patients more with more breaks. Like there are things that I could do that I'm actually more likely to do if I'm not beating the crap out of myself and taking full blame for something where instead it is more accurate to take my part of accountability for. You see? Even like who knows? Let's say the patient comes in, how did this happen? I can say, you know what? I can identify some things about how this happened. I will say like not this exact example has not happened to me. I would tell you if it did, but I'm just using it as an example that came to my brain. But I have had other times where, say, like a medication error happened or something, and the patient comes in, they're like, what happened? Like the main questions patients have is like, what happened? And is there anything you could do so this doesn't happen to another patient? Sometimes people are out for blood, I'm sure. But like, honestly, if I have done this work, so I'm not like running away from shame and afraid to see them or blaming them. And instead, I can say, you know what? I've considered all the factors that may have led to this decision. I'm actually interested in, do you have any insight of things that, you could see from my perspective if they're interested in participating in the conversation, restorative justice style? It's fine if they're not. But I could still say, I've identified some factors for myself that led me to be more distracted that day. I identified factors for myself with my EMR and how it flags things that I'm going to use this as a learning experience to lower the risk of something similar happening to yourself or another patient in the future. And that is me taking accountability. In my opinion, that is exactly what accountability looks like. It's not, you know, flagellating myself, beating myself up in front of them. It's saying, you're right. This is the decision I made, and it certainly contributed to this outcome for you. And I'm sorry. And these are some specific things I've recognized and reflected on that I hope will reduce the chance of this happening again. And is there anything else? Is there anything else I can do to make amends or repair trust with you? Right? Like I can be in a headspace to do that if I've first genuinely considered what happened. Right? And the really interesting thing is that was an example where really the you like ought to have been on there in the sense of like, yes, I prescribe the medication, right? Like I actually actively participate. What another really interesting thing to do this for is when you notice your brain and body taking responsibility, and sometimes you don't even end up really as a spoke. So like a classic one is I practice family medicine. A classic guilt and shame story I hear is when patients go to emerge. And so maybe you still want to put a little you on there. So go ahead, it's like you. But really ask yourself, so what could you have done? How did you influence the emergency room visit? You could have had more hours. Maybe if they'd called, who knows, right? Like you can think about, is there any way I could improve access to my office? And could that have potentially changed this outcome? Maybe. But definitely there are other spokes on here. So there's spokes about the patient themselves and their choices. There's the spokes about the context of the patient, the ecosystem in which they made the decision to go to emerge. So beyond just like now it's the patient's fault and they're whatever, they're using resources, blah, blah. It's like, this is a person where there's a language barrier in their culture. They're used to urgent care. Like, who knows, right? Like, you think of all the factors that led the patient to make that decision. There's also the factors of like the culture, the fact that anyone can go to emergency rooms where I live anyway, even if they don't have an emergency. That's a collective thing we've all decided. And maybe that's good. But I am increasingly wondering if it actually a really wonderful thing could be for emergency rooms to be able to say, you're not having even close to an emergency. So here's the list of walk-in clinics you can go to instead. Like, and actually just say no. I just wonder what would happen as a culture if emergency rooms were able to set that boundary. Sorry, that was a side conversation, but I just wonder about that. And that's something that we are just collectively deciding is the rule. We could change that rule. And would that change this outcome? I don't know. Maybe. Like there's all these things, right? So is something interesting about always writing out all of the factors that influence an outcome. And then when you get back to your spider leg, your spoke of the wheel, like whatever you decide to call this crude diagram, um, then usually you have space and understanding that you did not directly and solely cause this. There were many things of which you were one that led to this outcome. Sometimes you do this exercise and you actually can't even put yourself on this boat because you're like, I actually think that I literally had nothing to do with this outcome. Sometimes, but like it's such a useful exercise as a place to start. And it leads not to less accountability and taking responsibility, but more. We think if we point out only to ourselves, I'm not saying we do this to like the patient where I'm like, I want to point out all the other reasons why this happened to you. Some people are not ready to hear that. And it's not about them, it's about you, right? So pointing out to yourself, look at all of the different ways, all of the different factors that led to this decision that were out of my control. What a relief to know I'm not in control of all of that because that's exhausting and impossible. Now I can look inward with kindness, compassion, curiosity at what was under my direct control, or at least more direct influence. And how do I want to take account, take responsibility for that so that I can learn from it? Right. So that's it. That's basically the whole podcast was the spider exercise and really recognizing our sense of collective responsibility for when things happen. Um, I feel very similarly just about, things in the system. I really used to think if I worked hard enough and said the right fancy words to the right people, I could personally plug the right idea into the healthcare system and fix the whole thing. But more and more, I have come to recognize that's was a little bit of delusion of grandeur on my part. Never thought it consciously, but emotionally, I definitely did. But now instead, I'm like, these are all humans working in this system, and under challenging circumstances, and with some really inhuman ideas in their brains about how it's supposed to work that they've inherited from other people. And so I can put out what I think will collectively help. I can retain my humanity and offer a resourced human contribution in whatever way locally, or if someone wants my opinion less locally, like whatever, whoever's ready to hear it, if it's the right message for them, if it's the right piece of help for them, that's mine to do. And I can have faith that each person has the potential, at least, to wake up to the fact that they could do the same thing. And that's why I actually do this work, right? Is to give people the chance. I think the reason I do this as a podcast, as well as like workshops and stuff, is I like how podcasts you can consume at your own rate, at your own time. You could be listening to this podcast and I'm being like, okay, lady, none of this makes sense to me. But maybe a couple years from now, you're like, I think I'll re-listen. And now it resonates. Who knows? But I like how this kind of knowledge translation is a way I can have an influence and an impact. It doesn't mean that I'm going to get to own the whole outcome either way. And that's a relief, my God. But again, I am one of the collective and I can really enjoy and own my work within our collective sense in this human based, human occupied healthcare system that is working its way through something, you know? And you can do the same. You can do it a lot more powerfully, enjoyably, sustainably if you stop thinking that instead of the spider, it's like just a single line and then it's you and it's always your fault. And so practicing letting go of responsibility of things that are not yours to own and letting go of that in all realms is a beautiful thing. It brings you peace and clarity and a sense of yourself. And it also has amazing impacts on how you are able to help others. It feels like it's selfish or something, but it's actually the opposite. So yes. Let me know if you use it. If you try and use the little spider thing and you get confused or you can only think of 5 spider legs, I am sure I can help you think of more. So DM me or or write to me through my website. I'm happy to hear. I would love to know if this particular exercise is helpful to any of you. All right. And that's all I have for you today. So I hope you're all having a fabulous week, reconnecting with your humanity in small and big ways in healthcare. And I'll talk to you next time.